Thanks for that, Tom. And thanks also to Charlotte for the invitation, and also to the CGA group who have elected to bring me back again through distance delivery to join you and give you a bit of an update on some of the things we've been working on over the last few years, and even going back a bit beyond that to set the stage a little bit. Happy to join you guys in the middle of your winter. As you know, we're in the middle of harvest right now, so it's busy days here. The crop in Washington is quite good. It's quite heavy. Early production has had a bit of a challenge with sizing in some cases, but overall it's quite good. And prices are pretty good in this early half of the market. Just by quick introduction there. And Tom, glad to hear that I don't need much introduction, that I'm much beloved, I think was the phrase you used. So I'm not sure what's changed, but I'm happy to hear that. That's terrific news. So I want to talk about future orchard systems, and clearly I'm with a bit of tongue in cheek here using this title photo of a block that is very close to where I sit right now giving this presentation. Unfortunately, and you don't tend to see many of these orchards if you come and I offer you a tour through some of our newer orchards. These are the typical ones that we don't see, but they do exist, and they are rather frightening, and certainly not a part of the future, but they have been for many years. I want to describe where we've been going to get away from those systems and what growers are doing when they're replanting. And whenever I give these talks to an international group, I'll just take one slide to put in context my perspective. Right? I mean. I think several of you are probably familiar with Washington State and the sweet cherry production here, but our industry is currently a little bit over 20,000 hectares large, and that's been roughly a doubling in the last 20 years. When I started in my position at Washington State University, we were a little bit under 10,000 hectares. We're producing, on average, per year, it's projected to be a little bit more than that this year, of about 220,000 tons, and our average statewide, which includes some of those big old orchards that you just saw, is somewhere around 14 to 16 tons per hectare every year. And I'll get into it a little bit later about some of the tonnage that you can expect from these more modern systems that growers are adopting now. 100% of our industry is irrigated. Whether by under tree micro sprinklers or drip, or oftentimes a combination of both, because we do produce fruit in the desert, in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. We get about 170, sometimes 180 millimeters per year. And most of that is concentrated throughout those winter months. So we rely upon snowpack in the mountains that gets diverted through irrigation canals that then growers have access to. We're growing on excellent loam soils, mostly of volcanic origin, but typically quite good, 1.5%, 2.5% organic matter, reasonably good depth. There are patches and exceptions to that because we grow cherries all over the state at various elevations and various latitudes within Washington. And again, we're in a desert climate, so we've got and enjoy those warm, sunny days and the cool nights. As a matter of fact, I was just describing to Charlotte this heat wave that we're about to embark upon here in the next couple of days, where we're going to be well over 40 Celsius as our daily highs, and yet we'll still drop down to upper teens at night. It tends to be about a 35-degree Fahrenheit swing from highs to lows. And so obviously that is excellent conditions for growing top quality fruit. And again, I mentioned that previously, we get very little rain in this climate. So throughout Washington State, we produce sometimes closer to 60%, but always more than half of the nation's sweet cherry production. And yet we have very few population centers, Seattle, of course, being the most significant in terms of its population, yet less than 1% by far of the US population. So we're an export-based industry. A lot of fruit, big orchards, irrigated, and exporting that to around the nation and also to around the world. So the topic today I wanted to get into then is this idea of training systems and future orchards, and begin with a simple fact that sweet cherry trees, as many of you know, and you see it in your own backyards, and particularly if you travel around the globe, that it's trained to so many different systems. In fact, this photo that you're seeing here was taken in Australia a few years ago, and I'll pose a simple question: well, how in the world did you choose? And there are many different thought processes and approaches, both practical and and otherwise on how one would choose. But I want to go through that a little bit here. A place that you could start to look, though, is a publication, an extension publication, a co-authored with some folks from the Pacific Northwest, and 6 years ago now. This is available online. If you just did a quick search for this, as it's indicated here, PNW 667. If you just did a quick search for that, you will find it very easily through Google. And this is available online. You can download it as a PDF, or it's available as an app for your phone or your iPad. But in this training system sort of manual, we go through 7 different systems, and that varies from Spanish bush to steep leader to super slender axe and to the UFO system. So I thought it would be worthwhile to begin and say, well, what should you consider? And these are general terms at the outset. I want to get in later into some of the more details, which can make or break, actually, frankly, any one of those systems. One of the top ones is the interception and distribution of light. And this is fundamental, of course, right? Because all of our orchard trees are positioned and trained and manipulated to receive the solar radiation, and they of course go through the simple processes of converting that solar energy into chemical energy, which is then diverted into different meristems and different growing parts. But it is the most important input into your orchard, light is, and it remains free to all orchardists. And so we really want to maximize the interception and optimize the distribution of light throughout orchard systems, and they vary tremendously. And I'll show you just one very quick example later. Of course, the second one, and maybe this is primary in people's minds, is really what's the quantity and quality of fruit? In fact, when I talk to a lot of orchardists here, and we talk about training systems, they really just ask that first question of, what can I expect as the quantity or the yield of the highest quality fruit? And that's where they begin. And then everything becomes secondary subsequent to that. But beyond just the quantity and quality, we're also interested in the uniformity of fruit. And we've been doing rather intensive fruit quality evaluations over the last few years, looking completely strip picking trees and then analyzing fruit quality individually. And I'm just showing you very simply one example here based on fruit color with this CTIFL wheel that's being used to rank the color of the fruit. And you can see that for a couple of trees, this was the distribution of all the fruit in these trees. And then with some strategic horticultural intervention, and by that I mean just better pruning, we were able to shift to a high percentage of the population in the best fruit color category. And so we can improve uniformity of fruit within systems, and certainly there are differences in uniformity of fruit among systems. Growers in Washington State are very much interested in production efficiencies, and that largely relates to how quickly and efficiently can the fruit be removed from those trees. So we're looking at harvest efficiencies, but we're also interested in pruning efficiencies as well. How simple is it to prune? And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Environmental footprint is becoming a little bit more important, and something that growers are talking about here, trying to understand how they can minimize or optimize inputs and reduce the environmental footprint, reduce passes through the orchard. And there are also concerns over labor requirements, and that relates to production efficiency, but we're also concerned about labor safety. In some extraordinary cases, growers considering about moving to a pedestrian orchard systems to try to minimize use of ladders and improve safety. There are other ways of accomplishing that as well, of course. And the last one that I'm going to share here, as I think about training systems, and this is the one that's really driven a lot of our innovations and collaborations over the last 10 years, is what would be the future ability to adopt mechanization and automation technologies. And depending on how much time actually I've got today, I have a whole series of slides we could get into where we can demonstrate some of the work that we've been doing in mechanization and automation. So taking these general considerations, we've been working with computer scientists and engineers to come up with a very simplified training system selections process. So let's say you're renovating an orchard and you're thinking about what should we do? Well, we're very comfortable with this system, or we want to try a new system. We want to change and improve efficiencies, etc. And we know what varieties we want. We know what rootstocks we want. So how do you fit all this together? And we've got it actually rather simplified now. And this is what it looks like, where you have environmental footprint, your markets, your yields, fruit quality, labor availability, international trade, your orchard sites, cultivar, infrastructure, light relations, rootstock. Of course, this also is a bit of a joke. This is I'm just trying to suggest to you that it is rather complicated, and there is no simple way of making that selections process. And in fact, that isn't something that we're working on. I do want to be clear on that, I don't think there could ever be a simplified algorithm that we would just punch in and give you, this is the best system to use. Okay, the simple fact for growers in Washington state is that I estimate there are about 22 billion sweet cherries that need to be harvested every year. That's based on that number I gave you of 220 million kilos produced in the state. And based on some data that we've collected in terms of an average picker efficiency, if one person had to pick all of those kilos, it would take them 7.3 million hours, or about almost a million days, or somewhere around 2,500 years. And again, this is just a bit of hyperbole here, just to prove the point. There's a lot of fruit. It's got to get harvested, and it's got to get harvested well. And so we're very interested in the effects of improving efficiency, improving profitability, through manipulations and changes in orchard structure. I'm just showing you one example here of an old steep leader into a modern Y-trellised Tatura architecture with a blush cherry on wires with a 6-wire system. We'll get into these in a little bit in a moment. So if you go back to this question about what training system to use, I would suggest to you, and I won't get into the details because we've got about an hour and that's not enough time, but there are two general categories that I think, as a company, one would consider. What's the establishment? So how easy is it? How simple is it for planting purposes? And what are the costs involved related to tree costs, tree densities, early years of manipulation and pruning and training? I'm bulking all of that into this first category of establishment, related also then to the precocity. That's often driven by rootstock genotype in particular, but also by architecture. And there are several examples that you're probably familiar with, the differences among systems and their precocity. And now the second one then, in general terms here again, is just the maintenance, right? So after you've filled the space, the block is established, it's fruiting, you've got those early years of pruning and training under your belts. How do you maintain these trees? And so there are important keys to think about here. And I'm just selecting a few. One is managing the tops of the trees. This sometimes is overlooked, and we've seen many cases where growers have actually struggled with that. Now that they've filled the space, how are we managing the tops of trees, and how does that influence the remainder of the tree? A second one is renewal pruning. How do you, in this system, regenerate new, productive, fresh fruiting wood over the course of its lifespan? That's a critical component. And then how do you achieve sustainable and balanced productivity? And that, in fact, of course, is a whole nother presentation on that issue. But I've got here just two very contrasting examples. This is a block of a what we call a solax architecture, right? It's a central column. And then off of this column, you can see there's been a tremendous amount of, first of all, the use of promelin, which is cytokinins and gibberellins, and scoring or notching above these buds to get lateral breaks. And it was very successful. You can see there's probably 30 to 40 lateral branches, all of the similar age, that have come off this central column now. It's a little bit difficult, I'll bet, for you to see, but there is a tremendous amount of string in here where they're fighting with the architecture, and this is what it's based upon. Taking these more vertical branches and bending them into a more horizontal, and therefore a more fruitful productivity. By contrast, here we have multiple upright fruiting wood in a bush style. This is it's sort of I would kind of consider this a hybrid between a KGB and a more traditional Spanish bush. This photo was also from Spain. And a completely different approach to pruning and training, right? Now you're fruiting off spur wood or very, very short laterals off of these upright pieces. And you can see how they're managing the tops is very, very different in here versus the other block. So let me talk just one short example here of establishment. This is a photo that was sent to me from a colleague in Chile, Marlene Ayala, cherry physiologist there, and she and her colleague in the photo here were traveling in California, where the grower had set up their own systems trial, and they were comparing and contrasting the same variety and rootstock with KGB, as you can see here in the foreground, with those repeated dormant and in some cases with sufficient vigor, those summer pruning cuts as well to establish a good uniformity of those uprights, which they are anticipating would happen later in this season, right? Versus the same year these trees were planted with the fruiting wall they've done to a bit of a twist on it, but more or less it's the UFO. And you can see that there are clearly differences in precocity and early fruiting in these systems. And in fact, those are probably the two extraordinary systems in terms of their being very precocious and probably the least precocious. And I'll just go back again to that same contrast that I showed you, in this case, side by side. Differences in fruiting wood and structure couldn't be any more opposite. Single permanent vertical wood and horizontal fruiting wood induced with intervention, with scoring and plant growth regulators and a lot of tying versus vertical wood induced with pruning, with dormant pruning and then perhaps even summer pruning to have that vertical fruiting wood. So it can be a bit confusing, right? I mean, you go around the world, you'll see a lot of variations even within these distinct systems. One of the advantages that I've always thought I had in working in Washington State, where apples are king, apples the #1 agricultural commodity in our state, and apples, frankly, had access to dwarfing rootstocks decades before sweet cherry growers ever did. And so I've seen these orchard systems evolve over time with apples. And I think we're on a very similar path for cherries. But if I answer that question of what's successful in apples, for example, this is it. You're looking at one of two main systems for high density, profitable apples in Washington. And really the only difference between the other one is that, as you can perhaps just make out in the background, it's trained to a V architecture or sometimes a Y rather than a vertical wall. But this is it, right? Vertical walls, very compact. In this case, we're looking at Sci-Fresh on an M9 clone, where they're consistently getting 100 bins per acre year after year. And they're doing that through precision horticulture, so through precision thinning and precision management practices. And it is a very, very efficient orchard system for all things, right? In terms of light utilization, in terms of agrochemical input utilization, these growers are able to adopt low volume sprayers. Everything is very accessible to hand picking or crews, and certainly very amenable to automation and mechanization. And we've been partnering with a lot of commercial growers to test different means for incorporating automation and mechanization in here. So we've got those boxes ticked of light interception and distribution, input efficiency, simplicity of pruning and training. Now, some of you may argue that and say, well, actually, there's quite a bit of detail work in these systems, and that's true, I would agree. But compared to more complex structures, these are very simplified. And at the end of the day, again, its suitability of an orchard like this for mechanization, automation is really, really compelling. And we're excited about the future of tools that may be available. So let's go back to this cherry book now and these 7 different systems that are there. And actually, I'm going to add another one because the Tatur isn't actually there. But I want to go through these in some sort of fashion. And this is my own, you could say biased, but I feel like I've got a fair bit of experience now touring around the world and looking at different architectures and different systems. And I've come up with a rating. So I'm going to use these same categories that I had here for light, input efficiency, simplicity, and then suitability for mechanization. I'm going to rate these in the next series of slides. Yep, so you'll see this little table. Now, in this case, what I'm suggesting that the lower the number, the poorer the rating. Yeah, and it's a 1 to 4 rating. So a 4 would be the best case situation and a 1 would be the worst. And here we're looking at Spanish bush, which is not exactly a traditional Spanish bush, you might argue as well, but you understand the point here. In terms of light utilization, it could be reasonably good. Tend to have struggles with distribution of light depending on the pruning within a system, right? In these basal portions can get some heavy shade, and also depending on the vigor here. In terms of production efficiency, they're really quite good. This block was not a pedestrian orchard, but you've probably seen blocks where they have managed them as a pedestrian block, and so very efficient in terms of labor inputs. Simplicity, pretty simple system, I would argue, fairly straightforward for pruning and training, but really fails when it comes to the processes of mechanization and automation. Can't really see you adopting mechanical pruning in here, particularly with all the posts and the infrastructure. Certainly not mechanical harvesting in any way. So I think that one gets low grades. Here's a KGB block. And in fact, this is one from Tasmania. I don't know if Nick is connected today, but he may recognize his block here. And I'm suggesting that with the KGB, light utilization is similar, but fairly low. And one of the issues that I often see with KGB blocks is more about total available light to the orchard per hectare, and not necessarily light distribution within the tree. Where I'm downgrading KGB a bit is when I see a lot of these rows planted rather far apart based on the height of these trees that are grown. In terms of efficiency, it gets pretty good grades there. In terms of simplicity, I think it gets very good grades there. It's one of the simplest systems to train crews for pruning, and quite simple for harvesting. But again, low grades for mechanization and automation. Move on to the steep leader. This is a very, very popular system in Washington State. And you can see it's comprised typically of 3, sometimes 4 of these large permanent sort of vase-shaped uprights. And then they're almost treated like little central leaders, where you've got the horizontal fruiting scaffolds coming off of these. So you clean out the middles and you have this fruiting wood that's tended to be softer and weaker and more productive coming off of these laterals. So in terms of light, it's not that much different, I would say, than the bush or the KGB. It's reasonably good, can be, of course. And in terms of efficiency, I'm going to give it a lower ranking because we typically have rows of about 5 or 6 meters apart, and canopy height is very high in the 4 to 5 meters tall. So there's a lot of ladder work, and in fact, sometimes very detailed ladder work in here for pruning and training. And simplicity, poor grades for that. It's very difficult to get a block pruned to consistently and uniformly. And mechanization automation really couldn't be much worse, with the exception perhaps of one being able to do some post-harvest hedging to top these trees. And sometimes that's done, but that would be about it. Let's talk about this other system, the Vogel Central Leader. This is a photo we took in Chile a few years ago under rain covers. So in terms of a light utilization, I think it can be reasonably good. All of these factors depend on, right, the row spacing, the vigor in these trees, how well you've managed it within a structure and an architecture. Efficiency can be reasonably good. I put it on par with KGB. Simplicity, it gets a downgrade here for obvious reasons, right? There's the renewal pruning is very challenging in here to get renewals off that central column, particularly when the wood gets a bit older, and particularly if it's got a lot of shading in here. You can see also the strings. There's a lot of manipulation and tying involved, and mechanization and automation is poor. Let's look at an SSA block. This is a photo I took in Spain also a few years ago. This is one that was on a Gisela rootstock here, very high density planting. They're attempting to do sort of a vertical wall. So in terms of light here, actually it's quite good, or can be quite good. I would say that overall, these vertical walls tend to have lower light utilization per hectare, but within the tree, the distribution is quite good. In terms of production efficiency, it's also quite good. It's maintained into a very compact architecture, right? So you're fruiting off floral buds at the base of 1-year-old shoots that are born off that central column. And that can be fairly efficient in terms of picking and pruning. Simplicity, I'm going to downgrade it a little bit because, well, actually, you can see it right here. Some of you may be groaning as you look at the tops of these trees and see, you know, 4 or 5 of the larger caliber pieces up here. When I was in the block, we kind of called this the umbrella in each of these trees. So there's something's gone wrong here with the pruning and how they're maintaining and managing the tops. So it's not a really simple system to train to. But mechanization and automation is reasonable. You could certainly use platforms in here for picking or pruning. You could certainly use mechanical hedging for pruning and topping in here as well. Now, this is a system that for some reason didn't get included in that orchard systems manual. And it's we call it the Tatura, though it's a variation on a traditional Tatura. And this is a very common system now, particularly for growers who have had a lot of experience with this type of an architecture with apples, and they're also cherry growers. So this is very common for us in Washington. So here we've got about a 70-degree from horizontal, 70-degree angle to the Y. And typically, we're looking at 6 and sometimes 7 horizontal tiers, usually spaced about 45, maybe 50, if I'm converting from inches properly, centimeters between those tiers. And so that's a common structure that we're seeing now. And in terms of light utilization, it gets the top grades, particularly that angled fruiting wall. In terms of efficiency, it gets also top grades. Very easy to run platforms through here, eliminate ladder work, pick from platforms. Even some growers are doing this already. In terms of simplicity, it's not as simple as perhaps some of the other systems because there are concerns about those 2 things that I said at the beginning: managing the tops, and also how do you manage renewal wood. So I often think of these systems in terms of sort of a hierarchy, right? So there's one trunk that's primary. There's two vertical permanent scaffolds per side. So those are secondary wood. And then from that, you've got the horizontal fruiting wood, which is tertiary. Now what we're seeing is originally people thought, well, we're going to fruit on that tertiary tier, but we're seeing that as the blocks get older, you can't. So you lose the spurs on here to shoots, as you can see in some cases. And so they're struggling a little bit with how to renew that wood and sort of a quaternary level of fruiting wood. But for mechanization and automation, it's quite good. It's a very compact structure, very accessible to tools and automated systems. And I'll finish with the UFO. Because, of course, this is the system we've developed at WSU and working on, and for many, many, many reasons. And you guys have heard me talk about it before. And so, in full disclosure of my bias, of course, I'm giving it the highest ratings for the reasons that I hope are fairly clear. That V configuration to a UFO that you see here, and Steve, this is you're talking about blush cherries. This is an early robin here. And we had concerns about it actually not coloring particularly well, but it actually works out really brilliantly. And it works very well on that rigid arc frame as well. So similar to the Tatura, usually about 70 degrees from horizontal are these angled walls, and very efficient. The pruning and training is simplified and very amenable for mechanization. And we've been doing this for a while. This is a vertical cherry fruiting wall, 10-year-old. In fact, actually now it's 12-year-olds. I need to update that slide. But this is Tieton on Gisela 5, one of the very first commercial plantings where we were doing this split cordon leader, and then same approach with a vertical, unbranched or shortly lateral branch fruiting wood, which is now, as I see published in one of our local trade journals, the Good Fruit Grower was proposed as a new idea for apples. And this came from your neighbor, Stuart Tustin, and suggesting that, hey, this is our new idea for apples, right? Where we can do this with high densities and grow precisely the same structure that I just showed you for cherries. And I would certainly endorse that and say that this should be considered for apples. And we've got experiments with apricots, by the way, as well as plums in Chile, where it works especially well. However, I would suggest, of course, that none of this is particularly novel. And, here's an old English garden, espalier structure, very similar to a double cord on UFO or whatever you want to call the system. So it's all been done before, and we're just looking at new ways to reinvent the wheel, I suppose. Just one quick slide, and for most of you, you've probably seen this before, but how we established the UFO system, because I still get a lot of questions about that. We're suggesting now that you plant these unheaded whips at an angle of about 45, and we really encourage strong terminal growth. That's the goal in the first year. And then later in the year, before this becomes too lignified to bend, it simply bend down, and you keep that vigor in the terminal end. And then what we've seen repeatedly is that these nodes that are basal to these terminal ones in that second year will break. We find we do not need scoring or any intervention with growth regulators to get those breaks, that they'll actually grow quite well, provided there's sufficient vigor in the system and the trees are spaced appropriately.
Typically in the crops where you have choices, you have really strong ground, you're always going to go to the outside there.
So I'm not sure how well the video is coming through here. I hope that you're getting the general gist of it, but I wanted to talk just briefly about pruning, because it is, for us, it's the second greatest expense, of course, behind harvesting for an annual production budget, but it is far more difficult than harvesting. And I think that becomes apparent as you watch this gentleman, Trino, who was works with a local grower. They've got sort of a modified steep leader architecture you can see here. And he's pruning on one of the field days that I had several years ago. And I captured this just to illustrate that he's going around everything from the ground, but pruning that to this structure. And in the end, this is 71-second video, right? Again, this modified steep leader. If any of you were accounting as you watch this video, he actually does make 66 different cuts. So that's about a cut per second. It's pretty good. So you can tell that he's done this a few times before. This is not the first time he's made these cuts to these style of trees, all from the ground, of course. But let's think about these questions. As the group there was watching him, what are the rules, right? So now how does he explain to everybody who was just watching that? That's how you do it. So you can watch me, you can see what I'm doing, but how do you explain that to somebody? And this is more of a rhetorical question. But that is a challenge you've got to think about for any system. What about follow-up, right? So we tend to have large orchards with large pruning crews. How easy is it for you to train a crew, but then follow up with them 10 trees down the row, 20 trees down the row, and say, no, there's drift in this. You're not doing this right. You've gotten away from these rules. And then lastly, what about the ability to mechanize that process? Of course, every cut that he made was very selective. It was strategic and selective. And I would suggest that there would be little to no ability to mechanize that process. And so I don't see that just in general terms, I don't see that as a vision for the future. Of course, this is one of the reasons that we developed the UFO structure, was to simplify pruning. And that renewal process, which you're very familiar with, is of course taking out the largest, most vigorous uprights with sometimes with stub cuts. Although more recently we found that when we make what we call flush cuts, almost right back to the cordon, we tend to get even better regrowth from adventitious buds. But that's one of the first rules. And the second one is just to prune out lateral shoots. Yes, there's a little bit of detail to that, but it isn't much more complicated than that. I would suggest that compared to what you just saw, that we need to be thinking about processes and pruning processes that are similar to that. And we've seen it. This is a photo I took about a month ago of a new orchard. It's about 17 hectares. They've just planted to a new UFO block with Centina, the early maturing self-fertile type out of Canada on Gisela 6. And so these are all planted at 45 degrees and angled to the south, as we do here, or you would angle them to the north to avoid sunburn on those trunks. And once in a while, you see the perfect sort of response, a perfect sort of tree here. And I'll just highlight this one, where we've already got in that first year of planting an unheaded whip, we've already got a number of good vertical uprights. But what we're most interested in is vigorous growth of that terminal end here. So while it is nice to have these, let me back up. While it's nice to have those spaced out almost perfectly, what we decided to do was actually to pinch those back, because we know that these basal shoots will become excessively vigorous in the first year if we don't give the terminal end a head start. So these were all pinched, and we're promoting that growth, not touching that terminal end. Yep. And later in the year, that'll get trained down to a more horizontal level, closer to one of these two wires in that V architecture. And when you move towards maturity, this is an experimental block we had at our research farm with Skeena on Gisela 12, trained to a wide trellis UFO architecture. In this case, we were very, very close with the trees, just about 1 meter apart with 5 meters between the rows. No time to get into this, but I designed this block for fully mechanical harvest of fresh market quality cherries. And that's also one of the driving factors behind that training system, with those unbranched verticals in there. And these are data actually that Dougal may even recognize. These were collected years ago when I was lucky enough to spend some time with Dougal at UTAS and a sabbatical. We went into various blocks and just picked fruit that were either on vertical oriented wood or horizontal wood within the same trees. So we took all wood that was 2-year-old fruiting wood for Sweetheart and Lapins. And here's how it played out. In both cases, we were finding that the higher quality, in this case, larger fruit, were born on that wood that was vertical. And generally speaking, we find this to be true. And there's a couple of reasons physiologically for that. Typically larger caliper, more vigor in vertical wood. In other words, a stronger pipeline pulling up water and nutrients versus horizontal wood, where you tend to have less shoot extension and even a higher bud density. So maybe a higher crop load and maybe less favorable fruit to leaf area ratios in that horizontal wood. And I could show you a lot of other slides where we've substantiated those numbers that were collected years ago in Tassie. One of the interesting pieces of this is more actually anecdotal data, but there was a grower who was one of our first industry adopters of UFO, and he split out his lot of trees into 2 systems. His idea initially was to do these all to a central leader, and then we convinced them to try half of the block to the UFO. And overall, now that it's 12 years old, these are the averages that he's had, and these are contiguous blocks side by side over the years, where the production of the UFO has far exceeded that, as you can see, of the central leader. And sometimes it's confusing, but you look at these blocks with the vertical wood and you don't think that there's a lot of fruit in there, but once pickers start getting in there, there's a tremendous amount of fruit. As you can see here, just remove the leaves from that column of wood. And you can see other examples here where we're fruiting on stronger upright wood and sometimes able to have excessive yield, but also combined with good fruit quality. Okay, I want to finish up with just some different ideas, a little bit crazy maybe. This is something we've been thinking about for quite a while now. The question would be, if we agree that future orchard systems should be comprised of these very compact fruiting walls, the question then would be, would you prefer or favor a vertical architecture versus an angle, a V or a Y architecture? And this is very simple math that one of our local growers here described to me that was their thinking. This happens to be the grower who put in that new V or Y trellis UFO block that I showed you. They had a vertical block and they had 10 feet or about 3 meters between the rows. And so, if you think about it, there was 1 wall per row and 1 wall every 10 feet was the ratio. They decided that if they went at about a 70-degree angle to a Y trellised architecture, they would clearly need to separate those rows further to account for that. But they felt that they were going to get 2 walls now per row, and therefore 1 wall every 6 feet. I mean, that's very simple math, but that would suggest to you that the angled system has higher potential productivity. And I can substantiate that potential sort of from a physiological point of view as well. These are some data from a graduate student who finished 5 or 6 years ago. And we asked that simple question of, let's look at light relationships in vertical versus angled fruiting walls. And this is the system that she had developed with light sensor bars that were connected to a data logger. And so it would essentially measure the shadow as she drove down the rows in the alleyways. And so you're just looking here at a UFO vertical wall with the red dots, and the blue dots are a UFO in a Y trellised architecture. And this is over the course of a day, right? So sunrise over here and sunset over here. And it's pretty obvious, isn't it? And it's fairly intuitive that near solar noon, of course, with those compact fruiting walls, there is very little orchard light interception. In some cases, lower than 25% of all the light that's available to you and is free to you to size and develop high quality fruit is being wasted. Whereas that V architecture never dipped below 60% light interception, even at these around solar noon. So we think that that does follow through, and we see greater yield potential on these canopies. And I've shared with you just some numbers at the bottom here, some of these angled canopies where in a 5-year-old Santina on Gisela 12, they were 14 tons per acre, which is over 30 tons per hectare. And then the 4-year-old, they were over 25 tons per hectare with the same system. So it's precocious, yes. And I think it's that greater light interception that's driving it. Now, the other way that we've been thinking about it is these vertical walls lend themselves better to mechanization for pruning, which is the main drawback. And it's actually one of the key reasons that people remain interested in a vertical wall versus a Y. But here's another concept that we've been kicking around of saying, well, instead of 3 meters between these rows and then a 3 to 3.5, maybe even 4 meter vertical system, we're thinking about having the distance and having the height, roughly speaking, and going to a OTR, which is over the row type of management approach. We've been trying to get some federal funding for this idea for almost 8 years now. Haven't been successful, unfortunately, but we're working with a couple of growers this year who are interested in exactly this. So we've got a fruiting zone in that other structure, and we've got a smaller fruiting zone in this structure. But if we bring the rows close enough, I think it can actually work. And so it's basically taking the concept from broadacre crops, right, which are grown in rows, and just saying, well, let's have one toolbar that then would allow accessibility to all of these rows rather than a traditional tractor going up and down these rows. And I think this is something that I feel is compelling, and something that we're going to continue to work towards, understanding those relationships. They're fundamental, right? With light, fruiting zones, fruiting wood, and then all the other aspects to it. How do you renew the wood? How do you manage the tops? And what sort of a system are we interested in? But this is something where we're going. So as we look back then at this book here, we say, well, what are the ones to consider? I would suggest to you, based on what I've described, these are the ones that I'm most interested in, UFO or Tatura architecture, either in a vertical fruiting wall or an angled fruiting wall. I want to give a moment to talk about the super slender axe, because I've had a lot of growers here say, well, you said the SSA was also very amenable to mechanization, very efficient, and I'm going to show you a few reasons of why I'm hesitant to recommend it. You are looking now at a photo that I took just a couple of weeks ago in a commercial. We'd call it an SSA. This is a V configuration, so a very upright V, one tree to one side, another tree to the other side. Very high density block. It's a very, very precocious system, but you've got to have vigor in here, and you've got to prune in the spring. As you look at that photo, I mean, all of you as cherry growers, I think would have some serious concerns about it. I didn't do any defoliation in order to prepare this photo. That's the way that the orchard looked when I took the photo. A lot of exposed fruit. And that's because the basics for the SSA is that you fruit on 1-year-old shoots, or right, that non-spur fruiting wood that's at the base of last year's vegetative extension growth. And you can see them quite clearly here, right? These are reproductive buds. And you can tell that at this stage because they've swollen into that telltale globular shape of a reproductive bud, compared and contrasted with a more pointed shape of a vegetative node. So the danger is in pruning these trees dormant, as that grower had. So you had a side shoot that grew last year, and then you tipped it, but you tipped it back to a reproductive bud. And this is a really, really common mistake. And this is what happens, right? So you're looking at all of these lateral shoots from last year that set a very high percentage of reproductive nodes at the base of it, and they were all tipped back without leaving a vegetative node for regrowth. And it's surprisingly common with this system. Of course, a consequence of this, natural consequence is that this then becomes blind wood, right? These are single nodes in those axils of 1-year-old leaves. And so there will be no further growth or development from here. And when you leave yourself with no vegetative extension growth, you leave yourself with this kind of a situation, which I was teasing this grower a little bit good-heartedly, but this is like the buffet line for the birds too, because all the fruit are so exposed, and they've got a great spot to land there and have a go at the fruit. So that's the reason that I guess come back to this point of recommending these. I want to finish up then by saying, well, okay, if you were considering a Tatura style, like in the photo here, or UFO style, let's look at some of the key differences between these two. And it's intriguing in how distinct they are, right? The Tatura style system has a permanent vertical structure. You see that here. This is that secondary fruiting wood, right? So simple enough to establish. You're planting these trees vertically, you're heading them back and then taking those two most vigorous and best positioned shoots to fill the space to the top. And typically there's 20 to 22 inches between these tiers, and I'm showing you 6. In some cases, there are 7. So permanent vertical wood, renewable horizontal fruiting wood, about 20 to 22 inches apart. Now you contrast that with the UFO system, where we have now a permanent horizontal piece of wood and renewable vertical wood. And my suggestion still remains unchanged of about 8 to 10 inches between those uprights, as you can see in the photo here. So we're fruiting on decent caliper wood, spur wood on that, or sometimes very short lateral shoots, as you can see here. So these couldn't be more distinct. But if you look at them, if I put them side by side, if I said, well, let's take that UFO structure of 8 to 10 inches apart, let's put it horizontal, you would immediately reject it for those tiers being far too close together. And you'd say, no, there's going to be excessive intra-canopy shading. That's never going to work. And yet, if you do the same thing for the Tatura, and if you took that, the 20 to 22, and you spaced those vertically, you would laugh at that as well, right? Because it'd be far too far apart and you would reduce yield potential. So I'm suggesting that there's more work to be done on investigating these relationships with spacing of these tiers and light relationships as well. Okay, I will truly finish now with this question about a new system. Hey, maybe I know Dougal was there, and maybe some of you were also there. In 2017, we were in Japan for the ISHS Cherry Symposium. And as you got off the train in the station, there were a few little booths there and tables, and this company was here with these small potted cherry trees. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, right? Clearly, they were marketing it to living in Japan, high population density, but they love cherries. Well, you can have your own, or maybe, a balcony, a couple of these on your balcony. But it made me think a little bit more, right? If you had, 25 fruit on a tree, if you call it a tree here still, let's say that's 250 grams of yield per tree. So you would need 4 of these trees to get a kilo of fruit, right? Therefore, you would need 4,000 of these trees to get a ton of fruit. And if you spaced them 50 centimeters apart, which based on these little canopies, I think it's reasonable, you'd have just under 20,000 trees per acre, but that's how you could get 12 tons per hectare with that spacing. I think that's pretty compelling. That's something you guys might want to look into first. But now, what if you did 12 tons per layer? Right? So it's not just a single layer. We're stacking this up in a wonderful environment, light conditions that are going to maximize efficiency and productivity. And you're sliding these trays out and running them over conveyors and picking all the fruit off it. So this is, again, just to finish with a crazy thought, a crazy idea, but maybe that's a future production system. So as you guys think about it, as growers think about it, there are fundamental keys to success. And I'll just finish up by reviewing. Again, it's the right genetics, right? So it's understanding what's the harvest timing, what's the quality potential, what's the vigor, what's the growth habit, how does this particular genotype fruit? Is it more of a spur type? Is it more of a type that has lateral branching and fruit at the base of those shoots? We've got to understand that. How are you matching that with a rootstock to maximize precocity and productivity? But also understanding the implications that would have on spacing and regrowth and maintenance for long-term consistent productivity. And then it's putting it in the right system. So in summary, I'm going to suggest to you that the right system at least is one that's simple in pruning and training, simple to establish. I would prefer to see growers moving towards these planar architectures. As you see here, this is another commercial UFO block just prior to harvest with early robin cherries and efficiencies. So the efficiencies that the growers are able to accomplish with this type of a system are incredible. They're picking these fruit with platforms. They're doing all the work in the upper half of the tree with platforms and then the lower half from the ground. And so this for me is a beautiful example of what I think is a pedestrian orchard in that sense with no ladders. And thinking about the future, right? Think 20 years down the track and what might be changing and what might be coming in terms of technologies. You do a quick Google search for, robotics in fruit production and automation, mechanization of fruit production, you get a lot of noise. There's a lot of players in this field now, and big global companies are getting involved and interested in this. And so that only means that there will be new tools. Some will fail, but some will be successful. And I think if we think about building structures, orchard structures, that at least get you in the game, I think that's where we need to be thinking. With that, I will conclude the presentation. I guess we're just about an hour, so should perhaps leave a little bit of time here for Q&A. I don't have time to get into all of the examples that we've been doing with mechanization of pruning, mechanization of training, mechanization of thinning, mechanization even of harvest. That'll be saved for another presentation. But here's my email address. If you don't have time for questions today, I'm happy to have you guys send the questions through email. Thanks again for the invitation. So sorry I couldn't be there to join you and go out and see your blocks and talk about pruning and training and all these issues in your orchards yourselves, because it's always a tremendous learning opportunity. And I'm sure that you're all doing some fascinating things in relation to pruning and training. But thanks for your attention, and handle any questions now, if I may, Charlotte.
Thanks, Matt, for what is always a riveting topic and talk, and fantastically presented. We do have a question coming through the chat box already. I think they're starting to queue up. Have you looked at the linear meters of fruiting wood between the UFO and Tatura systems? Yeah, the simple answer is yes. And we find about 80 to 100% more actually in UFO versus Tatura. And it's as simple as what I just showed you with that math. The spacing between the fruiting wood when it's horizontal with Tatura is let's just say it's 20 inches, and it's really half of that with UFO. In both cases, though, the key is to renew the wood fairly aggressively, which is I would argue is simpler and easier to do with the UFO than it is with the Datura, or you end up fruiting off of that next tier of wood. So the Datura, you end up fruiting off short shoots off of your horizontal wood, which is very difficult to do. Or on a UFO, as you lose those spurs and they break into side shoots, you can manage those maybe for a year and fruit off of those short laterals, but then they need to be renewed. But yeah, there's a lot more fruiting wood per hectare. Now, I've got a question, particularly, I think your second last photo I thought was quite intriguing. In it, you showed a reflective plastic film on the interrow space. Mm-hmm. Now, certainly in Tassie, I've not seen that adopted much. Is that a common practice in the US for improving light interception? Yeah, let me move back. Yeah, you can see that one then? Yeah. Yes, again, the short answer here is yes, it is. There's a lot, right? There's a lot of details that we don't have time to get into, but what we found in terms of height and relationships and spacing in these architectures, and as important as anything is actually the porosity. So that lateral porosity in these fruiting walls, right? So how much light is coming through this wall, right? Over to the basal portions of this side, and then vice versa in the afternoon, how much light is coming through this side and getting to the basal portions of this side. And we judge that by assessing the shadow at this time of day. And I would say that this is actually probably a little bit thick, not as much porosity as we'd like. But particularly in the case, and this was growing blush cherries,
they've put down this reflective fabric to reflect that light that ends up being lost to the orchard floor back up into the canopy, and actually with really, really great success. In most cases, these kinds of systems, these materials pay for themselves within a year or two.
And does that also perhaps get away from some of the light interception challenges you mentioned about a single plane of vertical wall?
Not necessarily, but it could to a certain extent, right? So the main challenge with the vertical wall is that midday, that solar noon light that's just going directly down. If you do have, and in this case, you can see that there is a bit of a curve, a bit of a mounding to that. That's because they've got some grass, orchard grass underneath that actually pushes it up and creates that mound, and that's beneficial for sure. If you didn't have that, yeah, there would be some benefit to it, but not as much.
Excellent.
Michael, can I ask a question?
Go for it, Lou.
Thanks, Matt. Really enjoyed the presentation. Excellent, as always. So I'm thinking about rootstocks, and obviously you can't fit everything into the one presentation, but rootstocks are a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to training systems and orchard systems, of course. And, you know, those high density apple orchard shots you showed, they essentially rely on the dwarfing capacity of the M9. So in the Tatura trellis, where you've got the equivalent with cherries and you're training horizontally, you know, I'd imagine rootstock would be a critical part of that equation, and also variety. I assume you'd be thinking about spur bearing as opposed to lateral bearing fruiting varieties as well.
Yeah, for sure. You're right. There's not enough time to get into all of it, but absolutely, rootstock plays truly a fundamental role here in that puzzle of system and scion and rootstock genotype, and putting it together, and having to recognize that in terms of vigor, in terms of precocity, in terms of growth habit, fruiting potential. And we've seen some spectacular failures, right, of where it just hasn't all come together the way that it could. And on the other hand, some real tremendous successes of where they've understood those issues. And you know what? That's one of the most difficult questions that I would get from a grower. Say, hey, I've got this variety, I'm on this rootstock, I want to do this system. What should my spacing be in trees and rows and within the row? That's so difficult, but yeah, rootstock's fundamental to all that and trying to figure it out. We've gained quite a bit of experience now, right? It's not like the early days when Beachla 5 and 12 and 6 showed up and people said, oh, we love that, and then so many problems. So we've got a good history with them now, of pruning and training with precocious and dwarfing rootstocks.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking to a grower the other day. He's got a greenfield site. You know, he's tossing up about UFO, and he's got understandable concerns. You know, we don't have much experience of it down here, a little bit. Different soils to what you're working with over there, and not necessarily the availability of the rootstocks. You know, he's really sold in theory on the system, but he just doesn't know whether he'll be at the leading edge or the cutting edge, you know what I mean? So it's a real challenge in terms of, you know, how to shift things when you don't necessarily have that experience. Anyway, just one other comment was a question and a comment. So I noticed when I was over in Italy visiting Nicola Dell'Abate that they were pretty big on the bibaum training system. This is in apples. But it just gave another option for sort of spreading vigor, you know, decreasing the expenditure in terms of outlay for tree cost, getting good light relations, you know, good upright trees. Has that been played around with in the Pacific Northwest? What are your views on that one?
Yeah, definitely. We've got some systems trials where we're comparing more of a spindle architecture with the bibaum or biax, we'll call it, rather in vertical or V configurations with different apples. Yeah, and actually, that's right. I mean, we find that the biax works and looks very good. But right, depending on all those things that you were just saying, right? So you've got the right rootstock that can support two, you know, even this the FOPS work that you're doing with New Zealand and saying, well, let's try this sort of this cordon UFO structure for apples. I think we're looking now at some of the older rootstocks we discarded as not having sufficient vigor, but saying actually, yeah, we can cut down establishment costs and still get great precocity from some of these other rootstocks that we've discarded as we've moved towards the super spindle type of systems.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Back to the Future. That's always an interesting one. Are the flares going to come back, Matt? You're going to come out wearing flares? That'd be pretty excellent.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. The final one was, I suppose, thinking about the so-called new systems. And I guess, to be fair to Stu Tustin and his crowd, probably the novelty they've suggested in their systems is not necessarily the training system, but the spacing. And, of course, that's not new either. But I would just point out that, you know, in the Appalachian regions of traditional wine grape growing, they've been doing, you know, essentially what you're proposing, where it's sort of a closer row and fitting the machinery to the ideal light interception rather than, you know, having it to fit the machinery. And that their appellations actually stipulate that they have to, but the vines have to be this density and this rows have to be this width, and they got it worked out.
Yeah. There are examples. Yeah, that's a good point. There are examples in other crops where they've done this. We're doing it also with wine grapes here with these over the row sprayers that'll handle 6 rows at once, and they're straddling the rows with booms and just changing how we think about needing to have a single tractor access a single alleyway each time. Yeah, I think there's some neat ideas to be collaborated on and fleshed out a bit over the next decade or so. Yeah.
Cool. Two quick ones.
Yeah, could I jump? Sorry, Michael. Steve Chapman here. Could I jump in with a question, or did you?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. G'day, Matt. Yeah, great presentation. I was just thinking, you know, Mark and I have been working towards the ideal system for a number of years and haven't quite planted it. But anyway, we're heading in the same direction as your research has pointed. But probably, we can sort of theoretically get 40 to 50,000 lineal metres of fruiting wood in a hectare and, you know, maintain that 100 cherries per metre. But one question I have is really about the, so whether it's a UFO or a flat fan, is about the diameter of those upright shoots and their potential. You know, Stuart Tustin, I believe, developed the work in apples about, you know, just measuring that the diameter of side branches or upright shoots and therefore their shoot potential, because I think it comes back to about having rules for pruners. You know, if the diameter is too small, you're gonna have small fruit, and if the diameter is too large, it's going to create too much vigor and too much shade. So, you know, have you done any work, or are you aware of any work in that area for cherries?
Yeah. Thanks for the comment and question. Absolutely, for sure. It's quite clear, right? We did a lot of this whole tree harvest in cherries, also apples, but cherries are far more complicated, and measuring the caliper and at each spur location in this vertical system. So we know very, very well the relationships with caliper and vigor of upright and the quality of, and even the quantity of fruit. And it's very clear that we found that there's more of a cliff, that once you get below it, there's a real drop off in quality, that it's not that there's a linear relationship, that the bigger the caliper, the better. It's not like that, but there's a minimum, is our observations, that there's sort of a minimum. You go below a certain caliper of wood, and it's not going to hold and support good quality fruit. And so we've been trying to work with growers thinking about the early establishment years, if we're just talking about UFO, are so important to get uniformity or close to uniformity in these uprights. If you get some that are excessive and others then naturally become weak, and that's the population, the weaker ones that are never going to be productive. And so, yeah, we got to get good uniformity, get good uprights, maintain reasonable vigor in those, and that's where the best quality fruit will be.
Thank you.
We found in most cases they're better off actually cutting those out rather than trying to stimulate them with some aggressive dormant heading cuts and trying to get the vigor back in. You're usually better off going way down to the base and cutting those out and trying to get a new vigorous piece of wood in that region.